All right, so let's go ahead and create our first thread here. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, obviously. Say project. And it's going to be Java, of course. Say next. And we're going to make sure we have our entry point command line there. I'm going to call intro threads. Okay. Let's say this window. All right, so there we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create at the bottom here. I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call class my thread as such, and this thread is going to implement, right, the runnable class interface as such. When that happens, you will notice that we will have to implement a few things here. So I'm going to go ahead and click here, and we can implement the methods. It's just going to be the run method. There we go. Okay, so we notice now what we talked about, that every thread will have to have a runnable so that we can run the code inside there. On top here, I'm going to have a private message. Let's put a string here. I'm going to say string. I'm going to call this my thread. And while we're here, let's create a constructor here like this. Okay. So we have a constructor here, we're passing my thread, and there we go. So we're setting things up here. Now that we have that, let's go inside of our run. This is where we are going to write the code that will run. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to say s out as such. I'm going to pass in the name. Say my thread plus say starting. Right. So this will just print out my thread and then starting. And I'm going to create a for loop here. I'm going to say int count equal to 0, count is less than 10, count plus plus. Okay. Once I have that, what I'm going to do is inside here, I'm going to put thread object. I'm going to say thread. As you can see, there is a thread object there. Say dot sleep, right? So I'm going to sleep for a millisecond here. So I'm going to sleep for about 400 milliseconds. Now we have a problem. Anytime we instantiate or create a thread, we have to make sure that we put inside here a catch try, okay? Because things could go wrong and we want to make sure that we are set. And I'm going to say s out again. And I'm going to do here is I'm going to say in. I'm going to pass our thread here, my thread string. I'm going to say count is plus. I'm just going to pass the count. So essentially what we're going to do is as we go through this loop here, we have our thread, and each time we will sleep for about 400 milliseconds. Remember, this is in milliseconds. Okay. And then it will go and call, and then we'll see out or output this in, then my thread, whatever we end up naming our thread, count is, and I'm going to show the count each time it goes through. Okay. Now for our exception here, just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and say my thread, right, the string here. I'm going to just go ahead and say interrupted. And I'm going to copy this outbound here. I'm going to say terminated as such. Okay. All right. So again, what's going on here? Before everything goes and start running, we're just going to say starting here, right? So that we know this is where we're starting. Of course, we're passing my thread string here. Okay. And then we create a for loop, which will count from 0 to 10. Okay. And inside there, we're going to start a thread. But before we start, we're going to just go ahead and sleep for 400 milliseconds. So this happens each time we loop through. Okay. And at the same time, we're going to show this text that says in, then my thread, and then count is count, because we're inside of our for loop here. Okay, if something goes wrong, we're just gonna output here this interrupted string. Okay, and after that, we're just gonna say this was terminated. Okay. Okay, so now let's go to our main here. Remember, this is an independent class, my thread, which implements runnable. That's why we're able to have run method. Now, inside of our main here, this is where we're going to invoke our thread. So I'm going to say out first so that we can see text. I'm going to say main thread starting. And then here I'm going to construct my thread. So I'm going to say my thread, all right, because this is the class that I'm instantiating. And I'm going to call this my thread is equal to new. You know what? Let me change this. This is not, let's go to my thread. Copy and change the name. That way it's not misspelled. In this case here, I'm just going to call something else. Say empty. Okay, it's called new, my thread, like that. And what we need to do here, we're going to pass the name, right? Because this is the contract we have. Oh, I'm going to change to a thread as well. TH, because we changed the name. TH is that, like that. All right. So here we have to pass a name for our thread here. I'm going to call this child number 1. Okay. Construct my thread object. We are going to construct a thread from that object, right? So what I'm going to do is construct an actual thread from our previous object. So we're going to say here is, I'm going to say thread. I'm going to call thread class here is equal to new thread, new thread, such is equal to new thread. And we're going to pass our empty. Okay. This empty here. All right. Now that we have that, we can start our thread execution. So we can say new thread dot start. Okay, so now we're going to start our thread. Also make sure here that these two are similar, right? Because in my thread here, this is where we are setting up my thread string here, which is the name of our thread. Okay, very cool. Let's go ahead and run this so we can see exactly what's going on here. All right, so as you can see, it's running and stops at 9. Okay, now what's really happening here? When the count is 0, it goes through our code inside of our run here. And remember that the reason why we're able to follow this process to create our thread, right, to be able to pass this thread object here inside of when we create our thread, is because this thread here class that we created implements runnable, which is necessary to run a thread. Okay, because it contains the encapsulated function or method run, where we put the code that we want to run. So what happens here, of course, this is the first thing that runs, right? Because we are inside of our main. Once this runs, says here main thread starting, we next go ahead and create our object here, right? The object that implements the thread, which is needed to pass in here, right, to create the actual thread, and then we start a thread. So what happens now, you see, this is the first thing that runs, it says here main thread starting, and then we go into our run method inside of our class thread here. When count is 0, we wait for 400 milliseconds, and then we say in thread name count is 0, as you can see here. Right? And we go through, nothing happened, no error happened, and then we say system out thread terminated. As you can see, each time it goes through, we terminate the child, and we go back again, count is 1, go through, terminate the child, and so forth. So you can create processes that can run. You can wait for a second or sleep for a few seconds if you wish before the next process happens. Right? So you've now created your first thread and it's working perfectly. Perfect. So I'll see you in the next video.